What if prayer was never meant to feel heavy, and the fact that it does mean something essential has been misunderstood? What if the frustration you feel after praying has nothing to do with God's silence, but with a misunderstanding that slowly took root in your heart? And what if Jesus actually taught a way of talking to God that brings calm, clarity, and peace, even before circumstances change? Many people pray every day, yet carry the same weight when they finish. The anxiety doesn't lift. The financial pressure still tightens the chest. The broken relationships still ache. The silence still feels loud. And over time, a quiet thought forms. Maybe prayer just doesn't work for me. That thought doesn't come from rebellion. It comes from exhaustion. You pray because you need help, because life feels unstable, because you're trying to hold things together. But without realizing it, prayer can slowly turn into effort instead of refuge. Words are spoken, but the heart remains tense. Requests are made, but peace doesn't follow. This is not a failure of faith. It's a signal that something about the way prayer has been approached needs to be gently corrected. Jesus never treated prayer as a religious obligation or a performance. He didn't teach his followers to impress God, convince him, or overwhelm him with words. Everything Jesus revealed about prayer points to relationship, trust, and rest. When prayer loses those elements, it becomes emotionally expensive. When they are restored, prayer becomes grounding again. This is not about learning new phrases. It's about unlearning pressure. It's about understanding how Jesus actually invited people to speak to God, not from fear, but from trust. As you listen, don't try to fix everything at once. Just notice what resonates. Notice where your own habits align or resist, because clarity doesn't arrive by force. It arrives by understanding. And understanding changes behavior naturally. Why prayer often feels heavy instead of life-giving. Many people don't realize when this shift happens. Prayer slowly stops being a place of rest and becomes a place of pressure. You still believe, you still pray, but something feels off. Instead of relief, there is tension. Instead of peace, there is urgency. Instead of comfort, there is effort. And the hardest part is that you may blame yourself for it. Prayer begins to feel heavy when it becomes something you do rather than someone you approach. Without noticing, the heart enters prayer carrying responsibility it was never meant to hold. You speak to God while mentally rehearsing outcomes, timelines, and consequences. The body stays tense, the mind stays alert, and when the prayer ends, nothing inside truly settles. Jesus addressed this quietly but clearly. He warned against prayers that are full of words but empty of trust. He said that many people think they will be heard because of how much they say, but the Father already knows what is needed before a single word is spoken. Matthew 6:7-8. That statement removes pressure instantly if it is truly believed. Prayer was never meant to inform God or persuade him. It was meant to reconnect the heart to truth. Here is where behavior begins to change. When you believe God already knows, you stop entering prayer in defense mode. You stop explaining your worth. You stop justifying your need. The nervous system relaxes because it no longer feels responsible for convincing heaven. Prayer becomes a place of grounding instead of striving. Jesus also modeled this through his own rhythm. He withdrew to pray, not in panic, but in steadiness. Luke 5:16. Prayer for him was not reaction, it was regulation. It stabilized him before decisions, before conflict, before moments of intensity. That tells you something important. Prayer is not only for crisis, it is for alignment. A practical shift you can apply immediately is this. Pay attention to how you enter prayer. If you begin already tense, already rushed, already fearful, prayer will amplify that state. Instead, pause before you speak. Take one slow breath. Remind yourself who God is. Jesus began prayer with recognition of the Father before addressing needs. Matthew 6:9. That single reordering calms the mind and recenters the heart. When prayer feels heavy, It is often because it has been turned into a task rather than a relationship. Tasks demand energy. Relationships restore it. Jesus never invited people into religious effort. He invited them into trust. When that trust returns, prayer stops draining you and starts sustaining you again. If prayer has felt exhausting, this is not condemnation. It is correction with compassion, a gentle realignment. And it begins by releasing the pressure to perform. The internal posture that matters more than the words you say. Most people assume prayer is shaped by vocabulary. They search for the right phrases, the right tone, the right structure, believing that clarity of speech will bring clarity of response. But Jesus consistently redirected attention away from language and toward posture. Not posture of the body, but posture of the heart. He made it clear that what moves prayer is not how eloquently you speak, but how honestly you come. Jesus revealed this when he contrasted two people praying. One stood confident in his own righteousness, carefully choosing words that highlighted his discipline and moral record. The other could barely lift his eyes, simply acknowledging his need for mercy. Jesus said it was the second posture that was heard and received. Luke 18:9-14. That moment exposes a truth many miss. Prayer begins to work when self-reliance ends. Internal posture answers a critical question before any words are spoken. Am I approaching God to prove something or to receive something? Pride, even when subtle, keeps the heart guarded. Humility opens it. This is why Jesus repeatedly said that those who come like children understand the kingdom more clearly. Matthew 18:3. Children do not calculate worthiness. They come because they trust. This changes daily behavior in practical ways. When prayer starts from humility, the need to control outcomes weakens. The mind becomes teachable. You begin listening instead of rehearsing. Instead of telling God how things must unfold, you begin asking how to walk wisely through what already exists. That shift alone reduces emotional pressure. Jesus also taught that God looks at the heart, not outward appearance. When he spoke to Samuel, God clarified that people see externals, but the Lord sees what is internal. 1 Samuel 16:7. Prayer shaped by the heart aligns with how God already sees you. You stop trying to present a version of yourself and begin showing up as you are. That honesty builds emotional safety. A simple application you can practice today is to begin prayer by acknowledging your true state, not the state you think you should be in. If you are tired, say it. If you are confused, admit it. If you are grateful, express it. Jesus never asked for filtered emotions. He invited sincerity. When the heart aligns with truth, words naturally follow. Peace enters prayer not because the words are perfect, but because the heart is open. And openness is something God always responds to. When internal posture shifts, prayer becomes lighter, clearer, and more relational. You are no longer trying to reach God. You are meeting him. When prayer becomes a performance and silently breaks intimacy, there is a subtle shift that happens in many people's prayer life, and most don't notice it when it begins. Prayer slowly stops being a private conversation and becomes a kind of performance, not always for others to see, but often for God. Words become carefully chosen, tone becomes controlled, emotions become edited. And without realizing it, intimacy is replaced by presentation. Jesus addressed this directly, not harshly, but clearly. He spoke about people who prayed in ways meant to be noticed, admired, or validated. He said they had already received their reward, Matthew 6:5. What he was exposing was not public prayer itself, but the motivation behind it. When prayer is shaped by how it appears rather than how it feels, the heart is no longer fully present. Performance creates distance because it requires hiding. You hide doubt. You hide frustration. You hide disappointment. You speak words of faith while your inner world is carrying questions you're afraid to say out loud. and that internal split is exhausting. The mind stays alert, the body stays tense, and prayer becomes emotionally unsafe. Jesus showed a different way. He consistently withdrew to quiet places, away from crowds, away from expectations, away from image. Mark 1:35. That tells you something important. Prayer, for him, was not about being seen. It was about being real. The absence of an audience allowed honesty to surface. And honesty is where connection begins. This has very real implications for daily life. When prayer is performative, you tend to carry that same pressure into relationships. You manage perception. You avoid vulnerability. You feel the need to appear strong, even when you are tired. But when prayer becomes honest again, something shifts beyond the spiritual. Emotional integrity returns. You begin living more aligned, less divided. Jesus also said that the Father sees what is done in secret. Matthew 6:6. That statement is deeply comforting. It means you don't need to explain yourself. You don't need to defend your faith. You don't need to prove sincerity. God already sees the part of you that no one else does. When you believe that, performance loses its power. A practical change you can apply immediately is to remove the imaginary audience from your prayer. Stop speaking as if someone is evaluating your faith. Speak as if you are safe. If the words feel simple, let them be simple. If silence comes, let it come. Prayer does not need to sound strong to be effective. It needs to be true. When performance fades, intimacy grows, and intimacy changes how prayer feels. It becomes lighter, slower, more grounded. You stop leaving prayer feeling inspected and start leaving prayer feeling known. That is the kind of closeness Jesus invited people into. If prayer has felt distant, it may not be because God stepped back. It may be because performance stepped in. And the moment you choose honesty over appearance, intimacy begins to return. How fear quietly distorts prayer and turns it into pressure. Fear has a way of entering prayer without asking permission. It disguises itself as urgency, as responsibility, as concern. But underneath it all, fear reshapes the way you talk to God. When fear leads, prayer becomes tense, words are rushed, thoughts spiral. The body stays alert, as if something bad is about to happen if God doesn't respond quickly enough. Jesus spoke directly to this condition of the heart. He saw how fear drained people long before circumstances ever changed. When he talked about worry, he didn't treat it as a small issue. He addressed it as something that quietly consumes the inner life. He reminded his listeners that God is attentive even to the smallest details of creation, and then asked a piercing question about trust. Matthew 6:25-30. His point was not that problems aren't real, but that fear is a poor foundation for prayer. When prayer is driven by fear, it reinforces anxiety instead of releasing it. The mind stays in control mode. The heart braces for disappointment. Even faith-filled words are spoken with an undertone of panic. This is why many people leave prayer feeling just as anxious as when they started. Fear does not dissolve through repetition. It dissolves through trust. Jesus consistently redirected fear toward relationship. He told his followers not to be afraid because they were deeply valued. Matthew 10:29-31. That truth reframes prayer. Instead of approaching God as a last option, you begin approaching him as a steady presence. Fear loses authority when you remember who you are speaking to. This also changes daily behavior in practical ways. When fear no longer dominates prayer, decisions become calmer. Reactions slow down. You stop assuming the worst before it happens. Prayer becomes a place where perspective is restored, not where anxiety is rehearsed. Over time, this trains the mind to respond rather than react. A simple application you can use immediately is to identify the fear beneath your prayer. Name it clearly. Then, instead of asking God to remove the situation first, ask him to help you trust him within it. Jesus modeled this posture by consistently anchoring himself in the Father's care, even when outcomes were uncertain. John 16:33. That anchoring produced peace that did not depend on circumstances. Fear makes prayer feel urgent and fragile. Trust makes prayer feel grounded and steady. Jesus never promised a life without trouble, but he did promise peace within it. When fear steps back, prayer regains its power, not because everything changes instantly, but because you do. The mistake of using prayer to control outcomes. There is a quiet habit many sincere people fall into without noticing. Prayer slowly becomes a way to manage outcomes, to shape timing, to secure certainty. The heart approaches God already holding a preferred result, and prayer becomes the place where that result is defended. When life feels unstable, control feels comforting. But when control enters prayer, peace quietly leaves. Jesus taught something radically different. He showed that prayer is not a tool for control, but a posture of surrender. This became unmistakably clear in moments of deep pressure. When facing what lay ahead, he did not deny the weight of the situation. He acknowledged it honestly. Yet he ended with a release of control, placing the outcome in the Father's hands. Luke 22:42. That moment reveals a critical truth. Surrender is not weakness. It is trust expressed clearly. When prayer is used to control outcomes, the mind stays tense even after praying. You replay conversations, you imagine scenarios, you monitor signs. The heart never rests because it still believes the responsibility belongs to you. Jesus never invited people into that burden. He invited them to trust a Father who sees beyond the present moment. Matthew 6:10. That trust frees the heart from carrying what it cannot resolve. This has direct impact on daily behavior. When you stop using prayer to control outcomes, your reactions change. You become less reactive and more responsive. You stop forcing conversations, decisions, and timelines. Instead, you move with discernment. Prayer begins shaping who you are becoming, not just what you want to happen. Jesus illustrated this posture repeatedly. He prayed before choosing his disciples, before major transitions, and before moments of opposition. Luke 6:12-13. Prayer aligned him with purpose rather than guaranteeing ease. Alignment brought clarity. Clarity brought peace. That sequence matters. Peace does not come from certainty. It comes from trust. A practical application you can use immediately is this. When you notice yourself rehearsing outcomes after praying, pause and release them again. Say out loud that the result is not yours to manage. This trains the mind to let go. Over time, the emotional grip loosens. You may not gain answers instantly, but you gain steadiness. Jesus taught that seeking God's kingdom realigns priorities and relieves unnecessary worry. Matthew 6:33. When prayer shifts from control to surrender, something remarkable happens. The heart stops striving, the mind becomes clearer, and prayer becomes what it was always meant to be. A place where you lay down what you cannot carry and walk away lighter than you arrived. Why listening is the most ignored part of talking to God. For many people, prayer is almost entirely one-sided. Words fill the space quickly. Thoughts rush forward, requests are laid out clearly, and then prayer ends. What's missing is not sincerity, but silence. Without realizing it, many treat prayer as speaking to God, but not being with Him. And when listening disappears, prayer slowly loses depth. Jesus lived prayer differently. Again and again, the Gospels show Him withdrawing to quiet places, away from noise and expectation. Luke 5:16. This wasn't spiritual ritual, it was necessity. He understood that clarity, direction, and strength are not formed in constant noise. They are formed in stillness. Listening was not optional, it was essential. When prayer lacks listening, the mind stays in problem-solving mode. You speak, but you don't receive. You ask, but you don't pause. Over time, prayer feels repetitive because nothing new is entering the space. The heart becomes discouraged, not because God isn't present, but because there is no room to notice him. Jesus taught that God speaks gently, not forcefully. Scripture often describes God's voice as quiet, not overwhelming. Elijah learned this when God was not in the wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a gentle whisper. 1 Kings 19:11-12. That passage reveals a principle. God does not compete with noise. He waits for attention. This truth has strong practical impact on daily life. When you never pause to listen, decisions become rushed, emotions stay unprocessed, stress accumulates. But when listening becomes part of prayer, something shifts. You become less reactive, more discerning. You begin sensing when to move forward and when to wait. Listening trains patience and emotional regulation. A simple application is to end your prayer without closing it immediately. After speaking, remain still, not trying to hear words, but allowing your mind to quiet. This is not emptiness, it is availability. Jesus said that those who belong to God hear his voice, John 10:27. That hearing often happens as peace, restraint, or gentle conviction rather than audible sound. Listening also changes how prayer feels emotionally. It moves from effort to presence, from urgency to calm. You stop measuring prayer by how much you say and start experiencing it as companionship. That companionship is stabilizing. It reminds you that you are not navigating life alone. Prayer was never meant to be constant speaking. It was meant to be relationship. And every relationship requires listening. When listening returns, prayer becomes deeper, clearer, and more alive. You may not always receive answers, but you receive alignment. And alignment brings peace that carries you through the day. How unforgiveness and inner resistance block peace in prayer. There is a quiet tension many people carry into prayer without naming it. They speak to God faithfully, yet something inside remains tight. The words are sincere, but the heart feels guarded. Often this tension is not about unanswered requests. It is about unresolved resistance. Unforgiveness, buried hurt, self-condemnation, or anger that has nowhere to go quietly sits beneath the surface. And prayer struggles to bring peace where the heart refuses to release. Jesus addressed this directly, not as a threat, but as an invitation to freedom. He taught that forgiveness is not optional because it protects the heart of the one who prays. When he spoke about forgiving others while praying, he was not setting conditions for God's love. He was revealing a spiritual reality. A heart clenched in resentment cannot fully rest in God's presence. Matthew 6:14-15. Tension blocks peace, not because God withholds it, but because the heart is closed. This resistance doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it sounds like quiet bitterness. Sometimes it feels like self-blame. Sometimes it's anger you believe you're justified in holding. Jesus understood all of this. He met people carrying deep wounds and never minimized their pain. But he also never allowed pain to become a prison. He showed that release leads to freedom. Unforgiveness affects daily behavior more than people realize. It sharpens reactions. It colors perception. It keeps the nervous system alert. And when prayer is offered from that state, the body remains tense even in God's presence. That is why prayer may feel frustrating or ineffective. Peace cannot settle where resistance is gripping tightly. Jesus illustrated this through his own words and actions. Even while suffering injustice, he spoke forgiveness, not denial of pain. Luke 23:34. That forgiveness did not remove suffering instantly, but it protected his heart from bitterness. That protection matters. It keeps prayer from becoming contaminated by anger and fear. A practical application you can use immediately is to acknowledge what you have been resisting. You do not need to justify it. Simply name it before God. Ask for help to release what you cannot release on your own. Forgiveness is often a process, not a moment. Jesus never demanded instant emotional resolution. He invited willingness. This also applies to forgiving yourself. Many people pray while carrying shame. replaying past mistakes, believing they must punish themselves to remain humble. Jesus never taught that. He taught repentance that leads to restoration, not ongoing self-condemnation. Romans 8:1. When guilt remains after forgiveness, it blocks peace just as much as resentment does. When forgiveness enters prayer, something loosens. The chest softens, the mind quiets, the heart becomes receptive again. Prayer begins to feel safe. And safety is where healing begins. Jesus did not connect forgiveness to prayer to burden you, but to free you. When resistance is released, prayer regains its power, not through force, but through openness. And openness allows peace to finally rest where it belongs. How prayer quietly changes you before it changes your situation. Many people enter prayer hoping for external change, a solution, a breakthrough, a clear answer. And when those things don't happen quickly, disappointment settles in. But Jesus consistently showed that prayer works from the inside out. Before it reshapes circumstances, it reshapes the person who is praying. And that internal change is not secondary, it is foundational. Jesus often prayed before anything visible happened. He prayed before choosing his disciples, before facing opposition, before moments that would alter his path. Luke 6:12, John 11:41-42. Those prayers did not immediately change the environment. They clarified his alignment. Prayer grounded him in purpose, steadied his emotions, and strengthened his resolve. That inner formation allowed him to walk through uncertainty without being consumed by it. When prayer is reduced to a tool for changing situations, its deeper work is overlooked. You may leave prayer still facing the same problem, but if prayer has done its work, you leave with more clarity, patience, and self-control. Those qualities change how you respond to life. And changed responses often lead to changed outcomes over time. This explains why prayer sometimes feels subtle. It doesn't always bring instant relief, but it brings internal order. Anxiety loosens, perspective widens, emotional reactions soften. Jesus taught that peace is something he gives that does not depend on circumstances. John 14:27. That peace is cultivated through consistent, honest prayer. This has practical impact on daily behavior. When prayer shapes you internally, you begin to pause before reacting. You speak more thoughtfully. You listen more carefully. You are less driven by impulse and more guided by discernment. That is not coincidence. That is formation. Prayer trains the mind and heart to move in alignment rather than chaos. A simple application you can practice is to stop measuring prayer only by what changes around you. Begin noticing what changes within you. Are you calmer, more patient, less reactive? Those are signs prayer is working, even if circumstances haven't shifted yet. Jesus taught that fruit grows gradually, not instantly. Mark 4:26-29. Internal change follows that same pattern. Prayer also builds resilience. When difficulties persist, prayer strengthens the ability to endure without losing hope. Jesus prayed in moments of deep sorrow, not to escape suffering, but to remain faithful within it. Matthew 26:39. That prayer did not remove the challenge, but it sustained him through it. That same sustaining power is available to you. When prayer changes you, life begins to feel less overwhelming. Not because problems disappear, but because you are no longer facing them from a place of instability. Prayer becomes the place where your inner world is reordered. And when the inside is steady, the outside no longer dominates you. Jesus never promised prayer would make life easy. He showed that it makes life anchored, and that anchoring is often the very thing that leads to change you didn't expect. The moment prayer becomes relationship and everything shifts. There is a moment when everything quietly changes. Not because circumstances suddenly resolve, but because prayer stops being something you do and becomes someone you enter. Jesus never invited people into a method. He invited them into relationship. And when prayer becomes relational, the pressure dissolves. Many people approach prayer transactionally. They speak, hoping for exchange. They give words, expecting outcomes. But Jesus revealed something deeper. He spoke of knowing God, not negotiating with Him. Eternal life, He said, is found in relationship, not ritual. John 17:3. That truth reframes prayer completely. Prayer is no longer about getting God to act. It is about staying connected to Him while life unfolds. This is why Jesus addressed God as Father, not as a distant authority, but as a present, relational presence. Matthew 6:9. When prayer becomes relational, fear loses power, performance loses relevance, control loses urgency. You stop measuring prayer by results and start experiencing it as companionship. And companionship changes how you walk through every part of life. In relationship, silence is not rejection. Waiting is not abandonment. Unanswered questions are not failure. Jesus trusted the Father even when outcomes were unclear. He rested in connection before resolution. That is the shift many people are missing. When prayer becomes relationship, peace arrives even before answers do. This changes daily life in tangible ways. You stop turning to prayer only in crisis and begin returning to it in ordinary moments. You speak honestly, not strategically. You listen, not just ask. You carry God consciousness into decisions, conversations, and responses. Prayer stops being confined to moments and becomes woven into living. Jesus said that those who remain in Him bear fruit naturally. John 15:4-5. Notice the language. Fruit comes from connection, not striving. When prayer becomes relationship, transformation becomes organic. You grow without forcing. You trust without demanding. You move without panic. Here is the question that brings everything together. When you speak to God, are you approaching Him as a task to complete or as a presence to remain in? Say it out loud if you can. Let the question expose habits gently, not with guilt, but with clarity, because awareness is the doorway to change. God, we come to You not to perform, but to remain, not to control, but to trust, not to impress, but to be known. Thank You for inviting us into relationship, not pressure. We surrender the need for certainty and choose connection instead. Where there is fear, bring peace. Where there is guilt, bring forgiveness. Where there is lack, bring provision. Guide us daily, moment by moment. Teach us to talk with You the way Jesus showed, honestly, humbly, and with trust. We rest in Your presence now, believing that being with You is enough. Amen.